that. All right, I just hit record. All right, so now I'll share the screen again. All right, so remember, there are various answers that we can give to the question of selfhood, or as Locke puts it, what is the principle of individuation? So if we agree with the fictional Professor Weyrob, who is a physicalist or a materialist, then the self or identity would be the body. We've also talked about the Descartes, or I should say the Cartesian approach, which identifies the self or personal identity as soul, which happens to inhabit or house or be lodged in a body. And then there's the idea of organism, which is perhaps a different way of understanding the body, or of building on the basic conception of body. And you might also say that this particular approach to the question is a hybrid one, insofar as organism isn't simply body, but you might say it's body in motion, or body in process, I should say. So by motion, I meant processual motion, the motion of self-growth, metabolism, decay, and so forth. So that could be understood as perhaps a kind of activity or a process. And that's also where we locate Locke's approach to this problem, insofar as he identifies personal identity or the principle of individuation with consciousness, memories, or to use his technical term, which others will appropriate and build on later, apperception, which is to perceive that you perceive, or to think that you think, or to see that you see, to be conscious that you are conscious, and so forth. And this requires a number of elements. So I want to put us into some small groups for not too long, just to give you an opportunity to talk about problems for each of these. So if personal identity is identical to bodily identity, what were some of the issues that come up? What are some of the problematic consequences of that? And then also, what are some problems with the soul view? What are some problems with the organism view? And then lastly, and this is kind of how we ended our previous discussion from the former week, what are some problems that come up in response to Locke's identification of selfhood with consciousness or apperception? So I'll put you into some small groups and just give you a chance to recollect from our discussions, or perhaps to contribute your own insight if you've thought a bit more about this, where some issues come up with those various ways of answering the question. So does that make sense? Are there any questions or issues before I create the breakout rooms?
Yep.
All right, cool. So let's do that, and we'll stay in there for 7 to 10 minutes or so, and then we'll bring it back to a class discussion. All right, so let me create, I'm gonna make 6 rooms, and so each room will have 3 or 4 students. So I'll go ahead and make those now, and I'll let you know when to start concluding your conversations. All right, here we go. So I'm gonna send you to the rooms, and I'll see you in a few minutes.
Mr. Harmon?
Yep.
I'm not sure if you got my email on Sunday.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot.
Oh, no worries. Basically, I just got back from Seattle last night for like a service that we did. And so last week was pretty crazy for me. Also, I did Spanish 101 last term. I did it online. It was pretty rough for me to do Spanish through online. So basically, after consulting my counselors, I wasn't going to do Spanish 102 this term. I was going to wait till we get in person. But basically, through the format, they said the workload would be a lot more if I do wait for in person, and also waiting 3-6 months to do 102 wouldn't be wise, because I'll probably forget everything from 101.
Mm-hmm.
So I joined Spanish 102 on Friday.
Okay.
So anywho, I'm completely good. I just got settled, unpacked, and everything like that. But if at all possible, I'd like to do the quiz too, and I'll do all the form stuff tonight.
Okay, yeah,
Um,
I'll reopen the quiz for you.
all right, awesome. Yeah, I'll get all of it. I'm not going to fall behind by any means. I just had that week, but I'm going to spend the next 3 4 days just really getting it together, and uh, I'll be completely caught up by the end of the day for everything. That's my plan.
Okay, sounds good. Who's teaching the Spanish class, by the way?
It's Scott Rex.
Oh, okay, cool, cool.
Yeah, his agreement is just as long as I don't, for him, I can't be late for anything. When the term's over, I have to be done with my class. So I'm be a good student.
Yeah, sounds good. So yeah, I won't forget. Yeah, you don't have to remind me. After class today, I'll go ahead and reopen the.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so good.
All right. So if you want to head into that breakout room, and then Isaac, how's it going?
Good. Just had some computer issues that I just
Yeah,
had to
no.
resolve.
So we're in some breakout rooms right now. I'll go ahead and put you into one. And the idea is we're just considering objections or potential philosophical problems with the particular answers to the personal identity question. So if personal identity is body, or personal identity is soul, or personal identity is memories or consciousness, what are some troubling implications or consequences of these views? So that's what you guys are talking about in the breakout rooms. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right, cool. So I'll go ahead and put you into group 1 right now. Room 1. Okay. Right. Just waiting on room 2 to rejoin us. And I think we're all back. All right. Okay, so who wants to get us started? We don't have to start in any particular order in consideration of these various responses to the question of selfhood. But what are some issues that came up in your conversations? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I couldn't help but relate to our current reading for this week was Descartes. Just because like he's just talking about how fallible our senses are, how easily deceived human beings are. And so I really liked how he kind of questioned his ability to quantify his reality. And for me, that's a big part of like identifying self, because I think in the end, it kind of leads you that you are like kind of a spiritual being that has great potential, and that you know, so that's kind of where like I'm inclined to go. And I think for me, that was like just reading that reading was kind of like kind of shadowed other people's opinions that we read last week, because it was just to me that made the most sense of like humans being really fallible, our senses are deceptible. How do we know what reality is? And the only truth may be that there is no truth because of potential parallel universes, many dimensions, all these different variables that we are just perceiving and people have perceived forever. And that kind of ties in like ancient beliefs with modern day practices. I think we kind of went away from spirituality a little bit as a civilization of humanity. And I think, as technology evolves, it's just going to bring us back to spirituality. But so consciousness is the answer. And then it's immutable consciousness that's transformative and, has a source of God.
So did you say mutable or immutable consciousness?
Oh, that's a good question. What I meant by mutable by being like almost like it's so transformative so consistently that it's hard to like for the human mind to like grasp like certain exact like transition moments. So it kind of does seem like it blurs, but I'm sure at one point we'll have it unmutable. But yeah, I don't know.
So whether consciousness is mutable or immutable, and however we answer that question, what in particular about consciousness as an event or a process is understood to be mutable or immutable is something that we'll take seriously next week when we talk about Hume
Cool.
in particular, and some critical responses to Hume, especially I'm thinking on the part of Immanuel Kant, the famous German philosopher from the same century as Hume, who came a little bit after and famously said that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. And so Kant rejects Hume's empiricism, and it was actually the critical repudiation or sort of argumentative takedown of Hume's empirical approach to selfhood and other problems like cause and effect, for example, that we'll see later, that inaugurated what Kant himself referred to as the Copernican revolution in philosophy. And so we'll talk a little bit about that next week. But yeah, thanks for those comments. Anybody else want to jump in and maybe share what went on in your breakout rooms?
Yeah, so my group had a very similar discussion about how basically for all of the different forms of identity or the self, you could almost trick yourself in some kind of way. So with memories, you have memories that almost were suggested to you rather than actually remembering them. The soul, is very infallible and untouchable. So you basically, to really believe the soul, you have to just hope and with faith. The body is the most, grounded answer, but at the same time, if you have per se you were given another body, just one night you end up in someone's body and you're not sure why. I believe that a lot of people would end up kind of changing their personality to try to match what's expected of that body. And so I think the body, while the most grounded in our known reality, it can also be very, interchangeable or convinced otherwise. I think all of them, it's like with all of them, I think they're interconnected, and I think that's a big part of it. I think, your body is very connected to your memories, and your soul, whatever that may be, is connected to your body. And I think that but all of the things on its own, you can, trick it, or you can reverse it, or you can mess with it. And I think you can go round and round in circles all day, like they did in the story. You can keep going around in circles, raise one point, well, what about this? And I think that's why talking about the self is so complicated, because there is no single answer that's hard to, just concrete to, the self is a complicated idea.
Right. Yeah. No single one of these answers seems to be satisfying. So the brain, for example, which seems so attractive as the at least physical locus of the self for many people, you might identify it in this context as a necessary condition for the possibility of selfhood, but you might even reject that, for example, if we can sufficiently approximate the functions of the organ of the brain using artificial materials, then maybe you don't even need the physical brain to represent or create a source of consciousness. But even if we do take the brain to be a necessary condition for the possibility of conscious awareness or selfhood, we might say that it's not sufficient. And so I made a comment about how we're not all just these disembodied, free-floating brains, because the brain, of course, plays a significant, perhaps a dominant role in the constitution and perdurance of ourself, but not, of course, the brain alone. So then we have to build on the brain, even if we accept an essential relationship between brain and selfhood. So yeah, that's good. And then
Yeah, so
he was saying,
I just wanted to
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Just kind of one last thing to it. So kind of the way my group kind of came together as like a formulation of how to deal with it was the idea of emotions and how we emotionally feel about memories or our body is a very important factor to what we choose to make as our selfhood.
Mhm. Yeah, so feeling and emotion is important too. And we'll see that that particular dimension of one's identity is challenged as essential from the point of view of Descartes. But I just wanted to see the chat. Sophia mentioned earlier on that, like, what if you did, your consciousness were to change bodies, but a body that's blind, so you wouldn't be able to visually at least recognize that the change had taken place. So going back to Locke's example of the consciousness of the prince and the cobbler switching roles or places, let's say the prince wakes up in the cobbler's body, but the cobbler happened to be visually impaired or blind. So it might take that individual quite a while to figure out that this change had even taken place, but nevertheless identifies himself as the prince, while everyone else is responding to the physical presence of this person whom they take to be the cobbler. So then you would find this strange contradiction between self-awareness or self-perception and recognition, the way that that plays out there, and recognition of others that one encounters in the social context. And so that's an interesting question that we'll turn to when talking about Hegel later on. So the role of recognition in personal identity. Yeah, so let's see. All right, there's a lot of cool stuff going on in the chat, just for you guys to consider. Okay, anybody else want to jump in there? So you also mentioned, Micah, that memories can be falsified very easily. And this is true, and a number of you talked about this in the discussion forum and in our class discussion last week. And so there are a lot of issues with memory. So I mentioned before that we are, as individual subjects, unreliable narrators. And this can actually be, as a weakness, exploited by unscrupulous actors who are doing basically strategies and rhetoric, right, to constrain your consciousness and your beliefs and your understanding of the world in such a way that's amenable to their own efforts, their own projects. And so, for example, there's some research done a couple years ago about how easy it is through the power of suggestion to, in this manner, not physically, but through logos, through language, to implant memories in someone. So you can talk to someone and introduce a kind of baseline element of a past memory, perhaps from many decades prior, when someone was a child. And so they might have a general memory of an event or an activity taking place and its place in their history vis-a-vis or in relation to other events that took place. And so you might call their attention to that and then kind of slip in an inconspicuous way some other aspect and say, oh yeah, so do you remember what so-and-so said or what so-and-so did next? And if there's a sufficient foundation of existing mnemonic connections that the subject is making, well, then that can easily fill in a kind of gap. And then they can be brought to a place where they might even visualize, they might even come up with an image of the thing that's being suggested, even if it never happened, right? And so that's a method of, through logos or language, implanting memories. And then in a physical sense, research has been done recently on rats, such that these scientists open up the heads of rats, and by using light, they could activate certain memories in the rat's brain, and they would determine that a particular memory had been activated in terms of the behavioral response. So for example, one could activate a rat's memory of a potential fright where a cat or something is coming after it, but the rat sitting in its cage completely safe would start to shake or tremble and get terrified. And this stuff, you know, is pretty wildly unethical, I would suggest, but it's illuminating, right? It's telling about the weakness and fallibility of our memory. So that's an important problem. Yeah, and then hypnotherapy. And so we'll talk about hypnosis and the effects of suggestion there in later weeks. So I'm thinking it's in week 7 when we talk about Hume again, and then we read this crazy kind of sci-fi horror story by Guy de Maupassant. There's a moment of hypnosis that becomes really significant in that narrative. Okay, so anybody else want to jump in with some things that might have come up in your conversation?
I had a question
Sure.
about, not really a question, but like a struggle with the Descartes reading, if we were ready to start talking about that.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Yeah, we can. Is it related to this discussion or is it different?
Not exactly, so I can wait.
Okay, cool. I'll come back to you in just a second if no one else has anything to add, or if no one wants to jump in. But did something come up in your breakout rooms that we haven't touched on yet in any way that's interesting?
I could throw something in. That just
Can I say something actually that I just remembered?
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah,
I
go
don't
ahead.
know. We talked about the spiritual aspect of his conclusions a bit, right? And kind of the religious things. Because I remember we talked a little bit about some of his arguments and the influence of like his religion in them, specifically with like, being deceived by kind of forces that are outside of the scope of the understanding. That was one issue I just had reading it and related to the memory and stuff like that.
Okay, can you elaborate a little bit more? So what was the
Yeah,
memory on that?
kind of like how, like, not only was his reality had the possibility to be affected by forces that were outside of like the traditional scope of understanding, but also his ability to perceive reality, which I mean in turn obviously affects memory and stuff like that. Like his own memories could be affected, which like memory has a huge effect on how we perceive things nowadays, if that makes, I'm sorry, I kind of lost that train of thought, but
Yeah, that's right. I mean, memory isn't just a collection of the past, but it can actually play an implicit role, at least, in how we perceive aspects of the present environment in which we find ourselves.
because we're all kind of bound on like reference points and like projecting by things that we've experienced throughout life, which kind of is like a whole new layer of how we perceive and understand things going on in our world.
Yeah, good. That's a really good point. Yeah, I was going to say something in response to that. It'll come back to me maybe, but yeah, did you have, I think someone else was going to add something there.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of just in relation to like trying to bridge them together when people suggest like we're our body or we're an organism. But it was basically like I was just kind of help it think of like I think it was the Tibetan monks, or there maybe even Taiwan, that when China was trying to overtake their country, they protested by like lighting themselves on fire, but how they did it in a way where they didn't scream or didn't have a typical, they're able to control the involuntary responses to the most excruciating pain probably imaginable. And just like how powerful the mind or spiritual practice can be. Then also like that kid that sat underneath the banyan tree for like 6 months or a year in meditation, and it went to like kind of like a hybrid state where he slowed down his heart rate down to like a beat per minute, was able to maintain a meditation pose for many, 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 many days, and how that would kind of almost argue that, then also that we could exchange, if you could get a new spleen and get a new liver, get a new heart, you could change out your organs, then I don't think that you really are your body. So I'd just kind of argue that the self isn't the body.
Yeah, so there's the issue of being able to artificially constantly replace insignificant and crucial aspects of our bodily constitution, and then just the way in which that naturally happens as our cellular composition is gradually replaced every 7 years or so, right? Cool.
Yeah, totally.
So, yeah, Abraham, did you want to ask your question about Descartes then?
Yeah. So basically, I don't feel like I was getting out of the reading what maybe it was meant to do, but I kind of just like the concept of him sitting down and trying to completely wipe his like intellectual slate clean and remove all of the like predispositions that like former knowledge had put on his mind. That seems kind of like silly in a way, because how can you sit down and remove everything that you know? And it's kind of like, how can you have this like objective organization of consciousness whenever you're a conscious being yourself? You know, I think probably a lot deeper than that, but I kind of took it for face value.
Yeah, that's a really strong question you posed at the end there. So how can you have an objective understanding of the structure of consciousness when you yourself are consciousness? That would mean objective in the sense of standing outside the very object that you want to accurately characterize and pin down in its essential being. And that's part of the very problem that we're grappling with here, the problem of subjectivity, that we cannot escape our subjection to the external world, which imposes itself upon us. That is to say, we are subjects in relation to everything else as an object. And objective knowledge, which would yield certainty, seems to demand that we escape our subjectivity. And so what motivates Descartes' project here is, first of all, the kind of Socratic recognition that we are, as opposed to non-human animals or unsentient beings or even God or gods, we are beings that have to know, that is, that have to grapple with an uncertain or confusing environment or world, but because we can't escape the very source of that possible knowing, our subjectivity, we can never seem to achieve absolute certainty about anything. And so Descartes wants to try to start from the recognition of finitude, which is a different way to put what I just characterized. That is, that our knowledge of reality and the very time, temporally speaking, the very time in which we can come to terms with the fundamental unknowability of that reality and navigate it successfully is very narrow, is very slim. And so how can we, and it seems like, and this is what we do in science, for example, we presuppose that we can prove things to be true, and then we take it that we have to prove that certain things are true. But then what is it that vouchsafes or undergirds this very proof in itself? What makes it possible given our fallibility and our finitude? And so this means that from Descartes' point of view, we have to engage in a kind of paradox. And philosophy is understood to be paradoxical in this literal sense. Paradox meaning alongside or somehow beyond doxa. And doxa in the Greek is ordinary traditional opinion. So in terms of ordinary traditional opinion, how do we know anything? Well, we look around, you know, we touch things, we hear things, we smell things. But what's the problem? All of those could be precisely false. How do we determine the difference between reality as such and a hallucinatory opening or exposure or representation of that reality? Well, we say we can distinguish a hallucination from the real because the real is more constant, right, than a hallucination. And another important point is the real as opposed to the hallucinatory is something that more than one of us seem to experience at a given time, right? So I can go beyond my own finite subjective point of view and listen to you and say, oh, maybe there isn't a pink elephant in the corner of the room, or something like that. But then what's the problem now? That doesn't solve it, because it could just be that what we take to be real, because it is so constant, is still hallucinatory. It's just a constant hallucination. And even more terrifying, it could be that it is a communal, universal hallucination in which all of us are gripped precisely because of our subjectivity and consciousness. And so that's the real fear that's motivating Cartesian skepticism from the beginning. So if that's true, even what we take to be real, because it is so continuous, constant, and unchanging in our shared communal conscious experience, if that is itself an illusion or a deception, how can we ever possibly know things? And so that's the problem Descartes is starting with, and he wants to be able to arrive at a strong determinate conclusion in accordance with which we can be confident that we know things, but not by setting aside the difficulty and saying, oh yeah, you know, it could be a hallucination, but whatever. To instead take a moment to regard that problem very seriously and to try to come up with a solution for it. So does that make sense, Abraham, in terms of what's motivating this thought experiment?
Yeah, it kind of sounds like coming with the same like criticisms I am, but that makes more sense that he's doing it with a base layer of, I understand that this is flawed.
Yeah, so he's really trying to start with no presuppositions, no prejudice, no assumptions, no prior judgment on the state of things. But unlike ancient, say, Pyrrhonian skepticism, the point isn't to remain within that corrosive doubt, but rather he takes for granted that there is a way out. And so what is that strategy then? He's going to doubt everything until something arises through the experience of that doubt, of that skepticism that cannot be doubted, that imposes itself on us on an unquestionable, that is indubitable truth, and not for the superficial reason that it seems so obviously true that it's difficult to doubt, or it appears artificial or silly to doubt it, but in fact that it cannot be doubted, that to so doubt this very thing would be to engage in a kind of contradiction, right? So that might be a little vague or mysterious, but the idea is today and in our next session as well, we'll unpack that argument very carefully.
That's a big goal. Kudos for him for attempting that.
Yeah. But also it's important to note, and this might have been left out because it's in the preface, which I didn't ask you to read. He lays out some methodological conditions, right? He says, I'm going to limit this radical skepticism to the intellectual domain, not to the world of morals or practice, right? And why do you suppose he starts with that kind of constraint or condition?
Well, because you have to kind of narrow it down to one discipline, and then also like morality is its own discipline beyond the intellectual, I guess, aspirations or knowledge. And I'm not sure why does he?
Does anybody else have a thought? So what if he decided to extend this radical skepticism to every dimension of his concrete existence, including how he goes about the world, navigates it, interacts with others, his conduct and behavior? Why does he want to exclude that from his doubt and remain in skepticism only as he's sitting at home beside the fire in his little pajamas? So why does he limit the doubt in this manner?
It's silly, but it reminds me a bit of this part of Inception. I don't know if you've seen that movie.
Okay, yeah.
yeah, where they like go really, really deep into the subconscious and the whoever Leonardo DiCaprio plays like implants a idea in his wife's head that like the reality that they're in when they leave the subconscious could be like still dreaming. I could just see if you didn't go about that carefully, ending up in a mental hospital because you just couldn't trust anything. And like if you take that into the outside world and you're allowed to kind of dictate the way that you see things like social rules, like how you're supposed to treat people, things you're supposed to do, it could tear you apart.
Exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, social rules like wearing clothes in public. If you doubt that there is a public, that is, that there are actually people around, why put on pants this morning when I go to the store or whatever? Or if you're going hiking or something and there's a cliff, well, if you doubt that that's actually a cliff or that space and time constitute reality as we know it, well, why not just have some fun and jump off, right? So there are some dangers there. And I'm actually reminded, since I mentioned Pyrrhonian skepticism, I'm reminded of Pyrrho, so the famous ancient Hellenistic philosopher after whom ancient skepticism is named. Famously, and this is hilarious, like I think I might do this at some point. Someone should write like a sitcom around the life of Pyrrho, because he was so committed to his skepticism that he had his followers would actually follow him around everywhere he went to jump in and to save him. So like if he was walking around and there was like a horse carriage in the middle of the street coming straight at him, he wouldn't move. He would just keep walking and people would have to push him out of the way. Or if he was coming upon like some hole, for example, that he might fall into to his death, others would like move him out of the way. So there were constantly his followers around him to ensure his bodily safety, because that's something he didn't give a shit about as a committed radical skeptic. And so Descartes is for his part confining the doubt that he's engaging here methodologically to the intellectual realm. Now that might seem a little artificial, but it is, as I'll describe it, a methodological skepticism as opposed to the ancient version, which means he's being skeptical for a methodological strategic purpose in order to at some point leave that skepticism, get out of it. And this will be important for other things like ethics and morality later on, because he takes this to be the fundamental metaphysical question, and he uses the analogy of like a tree. And so metaphysics would be like the trunk of the tree, which gives rise to various branches such as ethics, social philosophy, and since we're talking about science as well within philosophy, optics, medicine, and so forth, all extend out of physics proper, all extend out of the root of metaphysics from Descartes' perspective. And in addition to being a metaphysician, he was also a notable physicist and mathematician who gave us, among other things, the famous Cartesian grid system that you guys might be familiar with from like high school algebra or college algebra, where you're plotting points on a XY axis, right? So that's one of Descartes' contributions. Okay, so any other comments or questions? I wanted to, before getting into some slides here, I wanted just for fun to take a look at the existential comic for this week. Did anyone read that one?
I didn't get a chance to look at it. Maybe I did. Let me look at it.
All right, so this is, I'll share the screen. So this is a comic called Cartesian Roommates. So it's set in modern times, and the idea is that Descartes is sharing a place with a contemporary philosopher, Baruch Spinoza. And so you might not get all of the joke if you're not familiar with Spinoza, who, unlike Descartes, was a metaphysical monist. So Descartes is a dualist, which means reality itself is essentially bifurcated into two mutually opposed domains, as we've talked a little bit about already. That is the physical and the non-physical, you might say, or mind and body, or the spiritual and the material. Whereas Spinoza thought that everything was one. And he was also a pantheist. He believed that everything was God, and this got him in hot water with doctrinal and traditional Judaism, and he was actually excommunicated, and he remains excommunicated to this day. There's actually a big discussion about this, I think 2 years ago, where major authorities, major rabbis were entertaining whether or not they should lift the excommunication of Spinoza, and they decided against it, and not because they disliked Spinoza, but because they thought that Spinoza himself would have been fine with the excommunication. But yeah, so that's just a little historical background. So here's Descartes and Spinoza as roommates. All right, so hopefully many of you get the punchline. If you did the reading, you probably got it. Yeah, and I noticed, so Liam said earlier, kind of like an extreme and literal take on the cave allegory. There are, of course, parallels. There are important similarities, and we are going to talk about the cave allegory in a couple weeks, so the week following the midterm. We don't have a midterm exam, right? But the week in which the midterm paper is due. But there are important differences, right? They're dealing with different problems, although Descartes is a rationalist in terms of his epistemology, as we'll see, and we'll clarify what that means. And Plato is arguably a kind of proto-rationalist. It's anachronistic to identify him with that kind of label, since it didn't arise until the 18th century or so. But in Descartes' takedown of traditional philosophy, that is traditional metaphysics, which had achieved dominance in these intervening centuries, the focus of Descartes' criticism is not Plato, but rather Aristotle. And so he's really kind of arguing for a return to Plato. And it makes sense then in that context too to recognize the importance of mathematics for both Descartes and Plato. For Aristotle, math was much less metaphysically significant. But okay, so yeah, that's a good good point. Okay, so any comments or questions? All right, so let's take a little break. Why not? you guys probably want to break? Or do you not want to break? What do you guys think?
I think it'd be good. Philosophy definitely has a way of exercising the mind.
Okay, you want to break? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I'll just eat a banana. I'll be right
Let's
back.
take a few minutes. So I have 11:30 on my clock, so like 11:33, 11:34,
Yeah.
something like that.
That's great.
Cool. So I'll see you guys in a couple minutes. All right. I am back. I see a number of us are. Okay. So let me share the screen and let's talk about the first two of Descartes' 6 meditations on first philosophy. And first philosophy, for those who might have been confused about this, is another way to say metaphysics. So first philosophy as foundational philosophy. But really what we find in this text is an argument in epistemology too. And it's really what inaugurates what scholars refer to as the epistemological turn that takes place in the 17th century. That is, where questions of essentially metaphysical import were turned. Let's see. Okay. Can everyone see the screen that I'm sharing? Okay. Yeah, so metaphysical questions were transformed to a more pointedly epistemological register. And Hume actually is going to take this to a kind of extreme where he's going to reject metaphysics altogether, as we'll see. Okay. So Descartes still comes to important, at least as he takes them to be, important metaphysical conclusions because of his epistemological approach. But that will be, as we'll see initially, and then we'll build on that later on, but initially next week, that's what Hume parts ways with. So let's see, let me start the slideshow. So here I've kind of filled in, answers to the questions that we were posing earlier about problems with respect to these various candidates for the principle of individuation or the principle of identity. So body, the self is one's immediate physical body. Well, as we've pointed out today, our bodies can change dramatically or subtly, yet one remains the same person. So Daniel actually mentioned this last time in the chat, the ship of Theseus thought experiment. I don't want to take much time at all. In fact, I don't want to talk about that yet today, but it's just to bring it up in anticipation of our discussion next week. So we will talk about that in the context of Hume. Also, one can know who one is and without sensing one's own body. So this is what we'll talk about on Thursday in response to the floating man thought experiment from Avicenna. One can imagine, and that's also, by the way, how Miller begins the second night of the John Perry dialogue when he says, you can wake up in the morning without opening your eyes to look at your own limbs, your own body, and still know who you are. You can imagine occupying an entirely different body, but remaining the same person. Then there's the brain rejuvenation thing. So what if you have the same brain? Your brain doesn't change, but it's been rejuvenated to match the psychological characteristics of another individual. So you would still recognize yourself as this other person rather than who you were before, even though you have the same brain. And then the problems with the soul. And remember, I separated the epistemological issue from the metaphysical one. So epistemologically, even if the soul exists, since it's by definition unobservable, it's impossible to know whether for every body there is one corresponding soul that remains identical in its relation to the body. And so this is where Weyrob says, what is unobservable cannot be observed to be the same, right? So if you can't observe the soul, well, then you can't observe it to be the same as it was before. And then there's the process approach, in accordance with which we've really only talked about consciousness or apperception. And some problems would be, as we talked about today, it's impossible to distinguish between real memories and false, that is, only apparent memories. And then also the issue that memory loss would seem to mean loss of personhood. And we'll talk about this in more detail next week too, when we look at Hume's criticism of Locke. But the problem seems to be grounded in the fact that for Locke, and this is a peculiar feature of his thought, we tend to think, so this is just how we ordinarily imagine or consider this relationship. So we think, first of all, in every case, I exist, and because I exist, I can retain certain aspects of my experience, and we call this retention memory. So because I exist, I have all these various capacities that define and circumscribe my existence, and one of those is to remember. But Locke is saying something rather radically different, right? Locke is saying, if we understand our existence to be our personal identity, he's saying, first of all, we have memory, and it's because we have memory that we have identity. And so that turns the traditional way of thinking it on its head. It's not like I am here and then I can have memories of my past. It's because I have memories that I can even establish my identity in the first place. And that opens up a host of problems. And one is that it seems to land in a contradiction. And so to put that contradiction very briefly, imagine your 20-year-old self remembers something that happened to your 8-year-old self, right? So now there is continuity between you at 8 years old and you at 20 years old. You can say, I at 8 years old and I at 20 years old am the same person. But now let's say you're 40 and you can remember shit that happened to your 20-year-old self. So there's continuity or identity with respect to your 40-year-old self and your 20-year-old self. Yet at 40, you don't remember anything about your life at 8 years old. So paradoxically, you're 8 here, and then you're 15 or you're 20 here, you're the same. And then you're 40, so you're the same as you were as you're 20, but you're not the same that you were when you were 8. So that seems like a troubling implication of this particular view, that you can suddenly stop being who you were. Okay, so we'll come back to this periodically as we move through these various ways of addressing and responding to the problem of identity. But this is just to take stock of where we've come so far. Okay. So we're going to talk about, and really for this entire week, we're talking about Descartes. There's a very short reading assigned for Thursday on Avicenna, who comes to very similar conclusions as Descartes, roughly 600 years or so prior, in the Islamic philosophical world. And we'll also read a very short story by John Pollock, a contemporary philosopher, who is addressing a particular skeptical issue in the context of Cartesian metaphysics. So here are the motivations. Why did Descartes produce this work in 1641, this series of 6 meditations? Well, he wanted, as we were talking about earlier, to establish scientific knowledge on an unshakable foundation, that is, on a stronger foundation. And throughout this work, he appeals to these architectural metaphors, right? So through the first meditation, he's really razing to the ground, R-A-Z-E, that is, destroying the very edifice of knowledge that has sort of insinuated itself and established itself through this intellectual tradition, beginning with the ancient Greeks, in order to replace the shaky foundation of Aristotelian metaphysics, which is a kind of proto-empiricism, with something less suspect. And so there are these two aims involved, only one of which we'll be dealing with this week, and that's the first, to show that mind and body are fundamentally distinct, hence Cartesian dualism, the idea that reality itself is separated into these essentially different domains. And then secondarily, but relatedly, to prove that God exists using pure reason or unaided reason alone. And so meditation 1 sets up the skeptical argument. Meditation 2 gives us the first argument for Cartesian dualism, namely the argument in accordance with which mind and body are distinct. And then he returns to that in meditation 6. So in meditation 6, which we're not reading, but we will talk a little bit about, he gives another argument to establish or conclude Cartesian dualism. And then meditations 3 and 5, also which we're not reading, he strives to prove that God exists using these two classic arguments in the history of that particular endeavor, which has fallen out of fashion, right? No one any longer really thinks that we can prove the existence of God using unaided reason. Okay. But really what we need to take away from this approach and the arguments that are set forth therein is what I have in italics here. So there are aspects of the external world that we can and must prove. And this is the injunction of science as we understand it. But this assumes in itself, that is recognizing that there are aspects of reality, the external world, that we can and must prove. This assumes that there are some things that we can neither prove nor need to prove because they prove themselves. And one of those, in attendance to this first aspect of his motivational effort, is one's own existence as a subject. And then the second is the imposition of God's very being as the existing source of all reality that unfolds in meditations 3 and 5. Okay, so does that make sense? Are there any questions so far on this?
What was the second one?
The second what?
It was one's own existence as a subject and the existence of God.
Yeah, that God exists. And in fact, this is, I mean, we're not going to read meditations 3 or 5, but he argues that God exists. He comes to that conclusion unshakably after first in meditation 2, having established that mind and body are different and the contours of these domains. So what mind is, what body is, and so forth. And then he tries to prove that God exists, and furthermore, that everyone, even if they claim self-consciously to be an atheist, knows that God exists, because knowledge of God's being is like a water, like a kind of, what do they call, like a signature, like the mark of the artist that imposes itself on our consciousness if we care to give it sufficient thought. So those are the things that he takes to impose themselves upon us as unshakable truths, but which can't be proven empirically through scientific methodologies, but which in any case prove themselves. So we won't really talk about how God supposedly proves himself, but we will very much talk about how one's own existence as a self-conscious thinking thing or subject proves itself and stands really as the ever-renewing event of thought. So anytime you think anything, however unseparated, or excuse me, however unconnected, the content of that thought superficially seems to be to your own self or your own existence, every thought points to or takes for granted or begins from the source of your own thought as identifiable ultimately with you. So anytime I say, you know, today is, so if I say, for example, today is Tuesday, implicit in that expression is the I think it's Tuesday. So when I say something like, oh, it's Tuesday, what I really mean is I think it's Tuesday, because the very locus of that thought as a content comes from the active source of the thinking that makes up my very being as a thinking thing. So that sounds perhaps confusing or mysterious, but we'll dig into that as we move on. So any other questions? So here are some things to note. His procedure, as I've described it before, is one of methodological skepticism. So what does that mean? To doubt everything until you find something that cannot possibly be doubted. Again, by that I don't mean, and Descartes doesn't mean, something which, because it's so obviously true, it seems to scream at you as an unshakable fact that you shouldn't doubt it. Rather, he's looking for something which cannot be doubted. That is, when you doubt it, you're actually not doubting it. So what this will amount to, as we'll see, is to be able, as a good scientist, right? So a healthy dose of skepticism, as we know, plays a major role in scientific methodology. That is how we characterize or caricaturize, as the case may be, what the so-called scientific method is. Doubt is important to that, right? Well, Descartes is arguing that in order to carry out the project of legitimate scientific doubt, you have to be able to not doubt something, right? And that thing that you have to be able to not doubt is such that it forces the undoubt. That is, it forces a kind of taken for granted confidence, which will prove the foundation for all legitimate knowledge. And so this connects to the assumption of epistemological foundationalism. So Descartes says in the course of the first meditation that he is leaving behind all of the received presuppositions and assumptions by which the whole edifice of knowledge was theretofore grounded. But he does begin with a kind of assumption. So that's important to keep in mind. He assumes that there is some foundation, right? So if you were to, so this is where he says at the beginning, it would be an impossible infinite project to, in a particular way, subject every belief that one has to this unrelenting doubt or skepticism. You would never conclude, you would never finish. So what he says is, if I can find out what all of these beliefs take for granted or presuppose or issue from themselves and doubt that thing, then going back to that architectural metaphor, it's like if you put dynamite on the foundation of a building, you don't have to worry about destroying every single floor, getting to the penthouse. If you dynamite the foundation, all of those layers of the edifice are going to collapse under their own weight, ultimately. So Descartes thinks if I can find the foundation for all of our knowledge and doubt that, then I don't have to worry about anything else, and then I can open up the ground for a new, more firm ground or foundation for knowledge. And so this project concretely amounts to challenging any explicit so-called objective presupposition where every concept refers to other concepts. So for example, in the second meditation, when he says, I'm a man, like what am I? I'm a human, I'm a man. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, we can perhaps turn to Aristotle's famous definition. A human is a rational animal. Well, okay, that doesn't help because now I have to ask, well, what does it mean to be rational? Now I have to ask, what is an animal? And then when I provide an answer for those questions, oh, I now have new questions, and it never seems to end, right? So he wants to find a way to foreclose this kind of infinite regress to give us a firm foundation as an epistemic bedrock, right? So epistemic bedrock is the essential and insuperable ground for all would-be knowledge. And that's really what he's pursuing here. So in meditation 1, the meditator, whom we might identify with Descartes, but in terms of the literary genre or philosophical genre that we're dealing with here, the meditation, it's worth commenting on a little bit, given that previously we read only dialogues, right? This is a meditation. So the meditator is saying, I found a little bit of peace, and this is important to interject something of history. So the 12 Years' War, which was a kind of weird religious conflict that as a non-historian, admittedly, I don't know very much about, but that is occurring at the moment, and Descartes was involved in that. And he some scholars have suggested that he might have been a spy, actually, but he notes in his work, Discourse on the Method, that he found a brief respite from his commitments as a soldier or whatever during this time to meditate, right? To subject to critical inquiry or interrogation, these very things that he problematically took for granted that stood in the way for a fruitful and unshakable development and confidence of the powers of science to not only know the truth of the world, but know ourselves within that world. And so as a meditation, the meditator is alone, right? He's sitting alone in his room, as he describes it, next to the fire in his pajamas. And he's thinking about all these things that he took for granted. And he says, well, and this is the challenge that he poses to scholastic metaphysics. So scholasticism, and not to belabor this point too much, but scholasticism is the dominant philosophical school. And so scholastics are often referred to as schoolmen, for example, in writings that you encounter in the 17th century and before. Including the Renaissance and a little bit before, but scholasticism was the philosophical school that dominated the medieval period or the Middle Ages. And what was scholasticism? Well, it was the intellectual authority or dual authority of, first of all, biblical scripture, so the Bible, this kind of ecclesiastical authority, and then metaphysically, outside of theology proper, it was the authority of Aristotle, right? So medieval theologians and philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas, as a scholastic, as a schoolman, had done quite a lot to close the gap between Christian theology and Aristotelian pagan metaphysics, to sort of reconcile the opposing tendencies in these philosophies, such that now much of what we understand to be Christianity is made up of quite a bit that was taken from non-Christian sources, largely Aristotle and Plato. And so that's what Descartes is grappling with. But what is it specifically about the authority of Aristotle? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's this kind of proto-empiricism. Does anyone know what empiricism is, or the adjective empirical? So what do we mean by that?
It's with measurement, right? Like, can be measured and quantified.
Yeah, so the words empiricism, empirical, derive from the Greek empiria, which really just means experience. So empiricism as an epistemological approach or school of thought begins with the assumption that all knowledge is ultimately derived from sense experience. And so it's through sense experience, and Hume will regard this, as we'll see next week, as experimental philosophy. So experience has to do with, as Amanda was just saying, quantification, measurement by appeal to various standards, which are ultimately grounded in our native sensory capacities, right? So going back to scientists, natural philosophers of the 17th century, I'm thinking of Galileo, he undertook an empirical approach to astronomy, right? And so what does that mean? He conducted experiments by means of apparatuses such as the sophisticated telescopes that he and others of his milieu had produced. And what is the telescope but an extension of the human eye, right? So it's building on the poverty of our native capacities, that is our bodily inborn capacities for empirical, experiential navigation and comprehension of the world. So recognizing these as foundational, but also weak in a sense, and having to be bolstered artificially. So that's really what Descartes is beginning with and wanting to reject, or at least at the beginning to call into question. So how do we know things about the world? How do we encounter what we take to be true and distinguish that from the false? Well, we think it's through the senses, but our senses are fallible, as he says. So there are all sorts of examples of this. He gives the example of a lack of proximity as a source of perceptual error or visual illusion. So for example, the sun, if you just look at it as an object before you, available to your senses, it seems very small, right? Almost like you could just reach out and grab it. Yet we know it's not small, but we don't know that through the senses, right? We know that through questioning what appears to be obvious as given through our senses, through a kind of intellectual procedure, right? Or think of, for example, if you put a stick in a river, it will appear bent. It might seem that the stick is bent, but you pull it out and you can verify that it's quite straight. So it's a kind of optical illusion, right? Or if you go to like a head shop or something and you get one of those trippy posters that work under a black light or something, or that have like the black and white spiral or swirl pattern, it will look, even if you're not high, as if it's moving, right? But that's a kind of optical illusion. Okay, so our senses can mislead us, right? They're not reliable. But as a good philosopher does, and here's this kind of nesting series of bullets, what does Descartes do? He makes a critical point. So he says our senses are untrustworthy, but then he says, well, let's challenge that point a little bit in order to strengthen it, right? So this is a rudimentary feature of the philosophical enterprise, right? To make a critical point and then to test that point by means of something like common sense. So that's what he's doing here. So someone might say, well, Descartes, those are pretty exceptional cases. For the most part, and otherwise, how would it be the case that we more or less successfully navigate the world without incident every day? For the most part, our senses seem to be trustworthy, right? So he says, lest I appear like one of those people in an insane asylum who thinks that their head is a pumpkin, or that their body is made of glass, or that they're really a prince, or that they're wearing some robes of velvet or something when they're actually naked. Lest I appear as this sort of crazy person, I want to pull back a little bit from that. But then the next step is, even if that's the case, that our senses appear to be more or less reliable, it could be that we're in the grip of a dream, right? We could be dreaming right now. So while experiencing a dream, being within a dream, and so this connects to, someone mentioned the film Inception earlier today. You don't know you're in a dream until you get out of it, until you wake up, and then you'll reflect or try to capture growingly or increasingly foggy points of reference that you encountered in that dream. But you only know that it is dream versus reality once you have escaped it. So that means at this very moment, all of us could be dreaming. Our entire lives, all of the memories that make up the order of our lives and its experience could simply be a dream, and we wouldn't know it, a very long dream. But of course, temporality gets quite compressed in dreamscapes, right? So does that make sense? You guys with me?
Yes, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So I sometimes feel like the meditator in these Zoom sessions. I'm just talking to myself. So I'll check in every now and then. So again, he having arrived at the very possibility that we could be in a dream and we would never know it, he says, but even if it's true that we are all in a dream right now, perhaps a communal dream of some kind, and that everything that we take to mark our ordinary experience is now suspect or subject to this unrelenting doubt, aren't there some things we can know? So this is worth spending a little bit of time with, even if it's true that we're in a dream. And remember, and this is taking us a little bit back to Socrates and Plato. What does it mean to know something versus to have a belief or an opinion? Well, it means to know the truth, right? So I can have a false belief, I can have a false opinion, but if I say I know something, then that means the content of this epistemological object within my own thinking has to be true, right? So even if we are in a dream, are there some things that we can know to be true? So what is still true when you're dreaming? So I give an example, as he does, of a mathematical object, like the sum of 2 and 2 being 4. But what are some other things that you could reliably understand to be the case or be true even if you're dreaming?
I'm still me, like the object himself.
Yeah, so I don't know though. Has anyone ever dreamed that you're someone else?
I'm a hardcore lucid dreamer. In every dream, I'm me.
I'm trying to think in my own experience.
I don't know what this says about gender, because I've always felt like I go by she, her pronouns, but a lot of times I have dreams that I'm a boy and not a girl. I don't know what's up with that.
That's interesting. So is it like you change, or in your moment of consciousness within the dream, you have this identity that's different from that you find in your waking experience?
Like, I still feel like me. Like, I still feel like the same person. I'm just me as a boy, and I don't notice any other difference, and I don't even question it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, building on the previous comment, you still know that you're you, right? Although the you has changed, at least along gender lines or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Any other thoughts? So what other kind of things can you know?
Well, when I dream, one of the things that like I know for sure is that I am like experiencing something. I am thinking about things, processing information and stuff like that. Even if I'm not like the same person as I am in my dreams, I'm still like a thinking, experiencing being who, once I wake up, I recognize was my experience as opposed to someone else's.
Good, yeah. So you kind of gave away Descartes' answer, the meditator's answer there. Yeah, insofar as dreaming is a kind of thinking, there is thinking. So whether you're awake or you're asleep, and those transitional or liminal spaces that demarcate the place of waking life from that of a dreamscape, there is a kind of continuity, right? Even if for the most part, and this is true with me, I have a lot of trouble recovering my dreams. Even if when you try to piece together that continuity, so you go to bed, you go to sleep, there's some narrative that gets woven, and then you wake up, there is, through all of that, despite the differences, there is the thread of thinking running through. And so then the question is, since there is the continuity of thinking that runs through waking life and the dream, what is it in the course of that thinking that is entertaining, not thinking as a flow or process, but instead attending to the content, so individual thoughts? So in terms of that content, what can we reliably embrace as true, whether it turns out we're dreaming or not? So math would be one of those things, right? So even if we're all dreaming right now, it's still unthinkable that 2 + 2 would equal 7, right? It's not something that we can even conceive of. So that means even if everything we've taken for granted as the case turns out to be one protracted fever dream, then math is nevertheless still true, the truth of mathematics. What about something like color? So in my experience, my dreams tend to be colored to the extent that I can remember them, but I only dream of colors that I also encounter in my daily experiential life, right? Perhaps I can encounter a different shade of blue than one with which I'm normally familiar, but in any case, it will be a shade of blue. So whether you're in a dream or whether we're talking about waking reality, there seem to be a circumscribable number of colors along this kind of visual spectrum, right? So there's some activity in the chat. Let's see. Right, oh, okay, yeah. So color is always true. So he says maybe we can doubt composite things, so complex things, such as events that we experience. They might be ultimately the product of a dream. And in that sense, in terms of our navigation of the world, appear as a break between our waking life and our dream life. So events or even creatures, right? So I might dream of some horrific, terrifying monster. But as Descartes points out, even mythical creatures like unicorns or centaurs or something like that, these animals that nobody has ever experienced because they're not real, they are nevertheless composites of aspects of real objects that individuals have experienced in the world, right? So what is a unicorn except a horse that happens to have as one of its appendages or bodily parts a horn, which we typically find on other animals? Or what is a centaur but a composite of a human and a horse or something like that, right? So you might dream of a centaur and you can perhaps know that it's a dream because centaurs don't exist. Those elements are indeed taken from reality. Okay, so even if we're in a dream, we can still reliably understand to be true certain phenomena or aspects of the real world which would not be altered in their essential character, leaving that real world for a fantasy realm like we encounter in the dream. Okay, so maybe those things are reliable. At least math is true. But here's the rub. There could be a supremely powerful being. At first he considers it as God, but that is impious, right? Because we understand God to be omnibenevolent, so perfectly good. And to deceive one is an example of imperfection, right? And so insofar as we understand God to be perfect, we can't imagine that God is the deceiver. But what if there's some supremely powerful being, an evil demon or some kind of evil genius? And so sometimes that's the word used in translation, which corresponds etymologically to spiritual phenomena like genie, right? Genies. So it could be that 2 + 2 = 8, but there's this evil demon putting this content in your consciousness, whether you're dreaming or awake, that says that 2 + 2 = 4. And since you can never get out, as it were, of the space of your consciousness, whether real as we describe it or dream, we would never know, right? So there's the evil demon at the end of that comic pouring out Descartes' orange juice, right? So does that make sense? And this connects to, modern science fiction takes, like, for example, the famous Matrix series. So instead of an evil demon, it could be that we're all connected. And this is the brain in the vat scenario, by the way, that we'll talk about Thursday. It could be that what we take to be the external world, made up of all these objects with which we're familiar, all of these bodies and phenomena, appearances, and so forth, that these are just electrical impulses as stimuli that are fed into some material substratum, like a brain or a computer or whatever else, that's making up the locus of our consciousness. And if we can never get out of that as a conscious subject to perceive these ultimate limits, which at this point become limits of confusion or obfuscation or deception, then we would absolutely never know, right? So this is the hard conclusion of skepticism that makes up the conclusion of the first meditation, where the meditator is brought to think perhaps the only thing that is certain is that nothing is certain. And this is what we call a crisis. So here's the pit of despair. But does it make sense where we've gone so far? Are there any questions or comments about this?
So math and color and those kind of things are not a certain?
Yeah, because even if the unshakable truths of primitive elements that make up our life, so color, or even more fundamental, the abstract rules of mathematics, even if these would hold unshakably true, whether we're in a dream or whether we are in the waking real world, it could be that there is some supremely powerful and evil, deceptive force that is actually, like in the Matrix thought experiment, for example, feeding these sort of beliefs or ideas which appear to be unshakable, but in fact, they're all falsities, they're all untruths. So for example, it could be that 2 + 2 = 8, and that all of the mathematical confidence that we have taken up in the course of our own individual lives and received from the continuity of history, that all of these things are just deceptions that are imposed upon us from a truer outside reality to which we never have access.
I think it's totally possible.
Yeah.
I think it's totally possible.
The worrisome part is there's no way to test it. And that's the part of the thought experiment that is given some extreme and entertaining focus in John Pollock's short story that we'll talk about on Thursday. And that's really the topic for the first reflection paper too, that's due Sunday. And when I say short story, I mean really short. It's like a page and a half. It's very short, but powerful.
I just have a quick comment.
Yeah, sure.
Like sometimes I have so basically, I've had dreams where I have mathematical equations in my brain and make complete sense when I'm in my dream, but then I wake up and make no sense. I'm like, e + 7 squared divided by 3 is the variable that equals the mathematical equation of the sun. And I'm like, in my dream, I got it, I figured it out. And I wake up, I'm like, that makes no sense at all. But that happens quite often. And then so I'm like, but it made complete sense. I had a revelation in my dream, a mathematical revelation. And
yeah, so I think you might use that insight to challenge Descartes, right? To challenge Descartes in such a way that it ratchets up or exaggerates even more this radical skepticism. So there seems to be a presupposition that dream logic is consonant with ordinary waking logic. But that's been challenged in a number of ways. Has anyone?
Inanimate objects in my dreams. So I do that once a month, where I'm literally last night I was expanding through Monday through Friday. I was experiencing all timelines at once. But then that metal that holds the eraser and the pencil, I was that metal holding the eraser on the pencil. My experience was that. So I can be inanimate objects in my dream.
Wow. So wait, you were the metal piece on
the pencil? Yes.
That's incredible.
I could be engines too, especially diesel engines. I feel the rev and the purr, and all the different movements in the engine. I am an engine in my dream sometimes, like a motor or a car.
I was actually about to mention the films of David Lynch, if anyone is familiar. with David Lynch as a filmmaker. He's one of my favorites. And through all of his work, including the famous television series Twin Peaks, he plays with what we can talk about in terms of dream logic, which as uncanny and frightening seems to be dramatically at odds with ordinary waking logic, right? So that's just a way that we could perhaps challenge some of Descartes' important insights here. And I think that's another way of saying, again, in challenge to Descartes, that perhaps even if we are minds most essentially, as opposed to being bodies, it doesn't really necessarily follow on that basis that we know ourselves better than we know anything, or we know ourselves as mind better than we can possibly know body, which is really the subtitle of the second meditation, right? So mind and body are distinct, and furthermore, we know mind more eminently, more clearly, more indubitably than we know body. We don't even need to dig very deeply into Freudian psychoanalysis or psychology to come to a differing conclusion, right? That we don't really know our minds as explicitly or clearly as we might hope that we do. Okay. So we're almost out of time, but this is just to set up meditation 2 in the cogito argument with which we'll begin class on Thursday, and then we'll have our presenter. So who's presenting? I forgot to check before class today. Are you guys here?
It's me and Daniel and
me, Isaac.
Oh, okay, cool. Are you guys good on that, or do you have any questions or issues?
We're good
if you guys are.
Okay, cool.
I could use a little explanation on it. I'm so sorry I missed last week. And so if you could just kind of quickly overview what we kind of did last week.
Yeah, so the idea is, as a group, you will take ownership over a small segment of our class session for discussion, focusing primarily on the readings assigned for that day. So for Thursday, although you can expand that, of course, to draw in some of the material from earlier in the week, so from today. So you can talk about Descartes, and in fact, really, that's what we are talking about. But the important thing is to focus on the readings for Thursday. So, and those are very short, by the way. So the Avicenna thought experiment on the floating man, and then John Pollock's brain in a vat story. Yeah, so the idea is you'll just sort of lead a discussion or conversation on those things for us. But does that make sense?
Wonderful. So it's just kind of more, we're taking a leadership role in the class discussion.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, for like 10 or 15 minutes, and you're free. And I encourage you actually to, draw on your own familiarity with some things from your background, your experience, or other things that you've encountered or read, or films that you've watched, or whatever else that you want to bring into this that we haven't really explicitly talked about.
Fabulous.
Okay.
Thanks so much for clarifying.
Yeah, no problem. So it's really at the end. So at the end of the first meditation, so we'll close up here, but at the end of the first meditation, the meditator finds himself in unrelenting radical doubt. And it's at the end of the second meditation that we achieve the goal, some kind of epistemic bedrock, right? And so that's what we'll talk about next time. And since you guys have done the reading for today, most of you, I'm sure, will have some at least understanding of where Descartes is going there. But we're really going to look at the Cartesian answer to the question, in some sense, of the principle of personal identity, of individuation. And so the answer will be, as we'll see, the soul or consciousness, but we'll get some deeper philosophical clarity on exactly what that means, which won't be profoundly different from the way we think about soul in the context of different religious traditions, but it will give us a way epistemically, so in terms of knowledge of self, knowledge of the world, a way to deepen those sort of ways of thinking about selfhood and such. Okay, so any final questions or comments before we go? All right, cool. So we'll begin next time with the second meditation, and then we'll transition to our presenters.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too. I'll see you guys on Thursday.
Take care.
Have a nice day.